One is that the main issue here is that the state of Israel does not have a long-term goal. It does not have a constitution. It does not have a real objective at what it wants to be, what type of country it wants to be, and that's why we always resort to the military policy of mowing the lawn. I'll explain that in a sec. And the second is that I think that I've noticed this a lot with this war, but I mean, it's going to happen with every single war, is that a lot of people don't understand that Hamas is a symptom and it's not the cause. And this doesn't come from this thing as in, oh, it's justified because of this violence or that violence. Is that there's a whole conflict beyond Hamas and Gaza that is constantly been raging on, and I've been talking about it for years on this channel as well, with the West Bank and Israel proper and the North and the South and all that. So the first part is that when you were talking about, for decades with Hamas, Hamas was the first, it was an Islamic charity, it slowly grew up, it became much more aggressive towards the state of Israel during the late 80s, early 90s, and then it started to resort to growing a more military resistance and attacking IDF troops and then civilians. And the IDF started to fight really, really harshly against them in the 90s. But it never really did anything about it. And then they were able to prop up a de facto government in the Gaza Strip and win the election, and have ever since controlled the Gaza Strip. Now, the Israeli military is incredibly powerful when it comes to actually being able to do a lot of damage. For example, when it goes into Jenin or Turkayim or these other areas, and it's essentially mowing the lawn, as in it takes out massive arrays of militant capabilities. I mean, it sometimes almost destroys the entire city. There was, I think, a massive raid in Jenin, I think about a year and a half ago, where almost the entire city was just all the main roads were destroyed, and it had gone arrested hundreds of people who were allegedly connected to these different militant groups and weapons and stuff like that. And the same thing with Gaza. I mean, when it comes to dealing with Gaza, of course, it took time to go into Gaza because Hamas has built up a massive tunnel system. And also when you have urban combat and you have a lot of civilians in the way, it makes it much more difficult. But the real reason I think that Israel hasn't been able 6 months later to, defeat Hamas and take over the Gaza Strip is the same reason why all of these militant groups still exist in the West Bank, is because we don't know what we want as the end goal of this country. Do we want Israel to be to have sovereignty over all of what they consider, of what this government considers Israel, which is both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and the Golan Heights, and that means to eliminate every single adversary force within these areas? Or do we want this to simply keep the status quo and deal with what we have at the moment? Or do we want this to become a secular state? So then we have a two-state solution. So then we should be having peace negotiations with the Palestinians, but at the same time, we're building settlements because we believe that Jews have a right to live within this land. And so they should be able to build lands and have homes there. But at the same time, this puts more and more chaos on eventual deals with the Palestinians. Then you have the Palestinian Authority, which on one hand has security coordinations with the IDF against the militants, and on the other hand, supports armed resistance against both civilians and military personnel of Israelis. And so it's all a mishmash of different ideologies and different perspectives and different policies. And so then you have the whole issue of mowing the lawn, which essentially means that every few years there's a war, we go in, we destroy whatever is near the border or near the area, and then we leave. So all that really happens is the other side gains experience and knowing how to combat IDF troops and another day to fight. And there's no end goal, because if Israel decides to take over the Gaza Strip, they have to then decide, what does that then look like? Does it look like a military occupation? Do we annex the territory and then give 2 million Palestinians Israeli citizenship and create a huge demographic issue in the country with voting? And until Israel answers this question on what type of country it wants to be, we're always going to have this problem. Now, the second is regarding Hamas, is the symptom and not the cause. Hamas, the Gaza Strip, what people define as terrorism, the attacks against our IDF troops, all of this is a symptom of a conflict that has been raging on for almost 100 years. It started with what we had with the Ottomans, then the Mandate, and then now present-day Israel. And it's evolved over those years. I think also something that's important to understand is that, something I've seen sometimes activists say is, well, Hamas didn't exist before the 80s, so what were the Israelis attacking then? Well, there was a different force that was attacking against Israel. It was the, as you said, Fatah and the guerrilla forces that were very, very much of a nuisance to the IDF and constantly had different reprisal attacks against IDF forces during those times. There was always different groups that were fighting, but again, all of these groups were a symptom of a major battle between different identities of, now some people see it as more religious, that it's more Judaism against Islam and who controls the Holy Land. Others see it as a battle of nationalism of being Israeli and being Palestinian and who has to control this land. And others see it simply as circumstantial and that everyone's fighting for their share of the pie and the justification for their history. And so I think that when we're talking about like the West Bank, I don't. It is true that Hamas isn't, we're saying, why is the IDF in Lebanon or why is it in the West Bank? Because Hamas doesn't control there. Yes, because there's entirely different things going on at the same time as the war against Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip. And so that's something important to remember, that there's many different dimensions to this conflict than simply the one currently being focused on right now. Of course, it makes sense that we're focusing on it because we have a massive civilian death toll on our hands. And so that's currently the main focus. But there is an entire conflict and the repercussions of this conflict going throughout the entire land.